Hello, this is Dan Corcoran. Welcome to my YouTube channel, De-Risking Healthcare. Today's episode with Leigh Ann Yates is a conversation about the expectations your finance department may have of you when it comes to the role they think you can play in optimizing revenue and the difficulties bridging the gap of communication between you and them. First, let me say our sponsor, SafeQual, has all sorts of software to help you pursue excellence. They really know what they're doing and have reinvented what software should do to make you and your healthcare system more productive at improvement, risk management, safety, quality, and compliance. They also believe in supporting this channel, so go visit them at www.safequal.net. So Leigh Ann, financial leaders tell me that clinical leaders are unwilling to prioritize the quality opportunities that can help the fiscal stability of the hospital. Does that resonate with you?
Throughout my career, I think that has always been a struggle to be able to get the right people at the table, so to speak, whether you're having a meeting about your claims and litigation, where you want the CFO to come and to be able to be a part of those discussions where you're talking about money being paid, money that wasn't budgeted. And oftentimes, there have been, lack of interest or from the CFO or the COO, perhaps, or their calendars would conflict. So I think risk managers in general probably struggle with that unless you have something that has been very thoughtfully structured and all parties understand the importance of their role. So for instance, I was at one organization, we wrote a charter and thinking about those that need to be a part of the committee, those that need to be present. It begs the exercise to really just think through on who you have available, making sure that finance is always a part of, but not exhausting them to where they're having to go to every single meeting. So I think that sort of understanding and that sort of mindfulness can go a long way.
One of the things that I heard brought up is, from the financial side, that they have various quality measures that if they can hit those quality measures, the hospital system experiences fewer sticks and gets more carrots from CMS, and that achieving these things are financially important even to the jobs and the existence of the hospital system. And they feel they've communicated this to the clinical side and they're not being heard.
Well, I think, there might be times when there's a lack of knowledge and understanding from the clinicians on how the finance side works, because not everybody gets training in that realm. So that would be my first comment. The second comment would be, depending on the organization and how it's laid out and all, the one thing we don't have enough of is time. And if, the finance side is trying to connect more to the clinical side and you're running around like crazy the whole day, like when do you have time? A lot of us that have practiced in the hospital setting or an acute care setting, your real day starts at 6 p.m. or later, because from like 7:30 a.m. or 7 a.m. till 6, you're going around putting out fires. So there's that issue of exhaustion, burnout, lack of understanding, and maybe a knowledge gap that might be a contributing factors to why the two sides are not being able to communicate successfully. So my experience has taught me, if you can just carve out some time to have one-on-one meetings and or invite them to the table when you're having your your very important meetings where you talk about cases and exposures and vice versa. Because if the clinicians, I mean, a lot of them just have that sliver of the pie. They don't have the sliver when you're talking about, the finance side, the insurance side, the litigation side. So you have to really, depending on where you are in this roles and scopes of the people involved, you have to consider that as well.
Sometimes the financial folks know there's an opportunity if they can close a small gap on something around readmissions or no matter how you describe the measure that can come to affect revenue. There's a difference between going after, say, those financial opportunities, right, and looking at things more broadly. You're improving culture, or broadly you're doing the risk or the job of risk management or quality, and you're raising everything. Do you believe there's a respectful, motivational approach that would work when proposing specific quality measures are prioritized?
Well, certainly, if you are raising and levitating the organization across the board, everything's going to get better, which means there's reduction in loss and a reduction in exposure and reduction in financials being paid out. So everyone benefits. If your quality is good, your risk is good, then you can identify your loss exposures and either nip it in the bud or catch it before it's a already done deal where you're just going to have to face it and get the checkbook out and write a check. So I think, for, like I indicated earlier, like if you have the knowledge gap and the clinicians don't really understand like CMS and the payments and where all the streams of income are coming from, that's critical. Or they might have a misunderstanding. So I think the challenge of the finance guys they're there to keep the hospitals open, the hospital running, and the streams of income coming in, so that can happen. It's a very fine-tuned balancing act, and sometimes it gets cattywampus and things aren't going so smoothly. But the things that I consistently see throughout my business practice is the lack of knowledge, lack of time, lack of the right people being in the room in those important meetings to be able to maybe shore up those knowledge gaps and understand, oh, now I get it. Actually, the other thing that I have found to be effective is rounding. Maybe the finance people should round with the clinicians, and the clinicians should round with the finance people to kind of get a better understanding of how things work globally.
Yes, the idea of financial and clinical people rounding together could provide a more mutual understanding of their goals. What would you say to the financial people, or what would be an example of a good response, a typical response, and maybe a bad response to the financial folks asking the clinical side to hit some improvement for attaining a financial goal, say around a quality measure?
I think it's important for the finance people to kind of understand where the clinicians are, because oftentimes their budgets are really strained and they may not have enough staff to hit that measure. And usually that's the case, or some, if they have a big, if they're in like a union territory and maybe there's a strike and there was a whole bunch of staff that went on strike, and then you're having to bring in other contracted folks. So there's a myriad of reasons for things when they go awry. And I think that it is a little bit unrealistic for the finance people to assume when they are, want to talk to a clinical leader and say, look, I need you to hit this measure, because maybe that will enable the organization to operationally and financially have, more funds, which, should trickle across the board and be helpful in that regard. So, but like I said before, I think, the lack of understanding of each side is really probably the root of a lot of the challenges and barriers that are in place. Because, if you don't have enough staff, you can't hit the measure, and you're just, doing, the nuts and bolts that have to be done to keep patients safe. But maybe it would be a safer environment if you had more staff, or if you had a different process, or if you had X, Y, and Z. It could be a lot of different things. So the finance people must keep that in mind, because a lot of times we're talking life and death, patient harm versus, no patient harm. And the thing that's standing in between the two is the human interaction and the human care, the provider, the caretaker, the clinician. So it's important that, they have a safe environment to practice. They have enough people to practice to mitigate the loss. They have the right policies and procedures, that sort of thing. And I think if the finance people could understand that whole realm and how complicated it could be, then they might think about things differently. But that being said, for the two to come together and be married in their relationship and be in step with one another, they've got to both be respectful enough to have each side at the table for those important conversations, for them to have a growing relationship that leads to more successful outcomes and outputs.
Leigh Ann, how can clinical leaders convincingly present their need for increased budget or other resources?
The last thing that people want is another meeting on their calendar. So I think they have to be thoughtful about what meetings are most important for an opportunity to share information, knowledge gap, reduced, all of that. So that would be the caveat that I would add, is be very selective and figure out, like any advice I would give for risk assessments. What is your goal? And where are you today and where you want to be tomorrow, next month, next year? And line that up first, because if you haven't thought about those things first, you probably shouldn't even be wasting somebody's time. So I would think about those, map it out, and then figure out who the key players are that you need on your team to hit those marks. So whether it's the CNO, whether it's the clinical leaders of the different service lines, say for instance, you have a service line of cardiology and it's a big moneymaker, and you need that leader to hit some marks and some measures, then start thinking about who that leader is and add that person to your meeting when you have those critical meetings, and kind of foster that relationship to grow. So there's a full understanding of what the organizational goal is versus the departmental goal. And if there's any barriers, then they can talk amongst themselves about those.
Now, if we work the other way, I'm sure there's risk managers that would like to educate, train, communicate better to the finance side, right? To have a way of getting the resources they want. How would that work in reverse? How could the folks in risk, quality, and safety reach out to the finance folks? And I kind of ask this question in the context of, is HFMA or ASHRM or both in the position to help foster a better relationship between the two sides of the organization and to help dissolve the silos that exist?
I think one thing, that might help risk managers is to ask the question to the finance people, okay, for me to get budget dollars, what would you want to see? If I wanted to get maybe $100,000 more in my budget or whatever, it might be 200,000, or I wanted to buy a piece of new equipment, what do I got to demonstrate to the finance team or to those leaders for it to be a green light? So oftentimes that's like a moving target, and we sit and wait to see if the budget's going to be approved and whatever we submitted. It might be helpful to put some parameters around that to kind of demonstrate what a successful submission might look like. And again, you might be dealing with different levels of knowledge levels and experience levels on the clinical side, where maybe they haven't submitted anything before to ask for increased budget or for some sort of something extra. But I think that could be a value add for the finance team to the risk management team to say, look, here's what we look for, because we are finance people. We think in terms of, dollars and cents, and dollars going out the door, dollars coming in the door. And it's much different on the clinical side. They're not necessarily finance people. So I would say that if they have any standardized information that they look for, and if it's missing, it's an automatic strike, you're out, you're not getting it. What is that?
I wonder if either side could also put together some podcast that they could share with the other to listen and understand their side.
Probably, yeah, if they had time.
One of the odd things I find is when I'm talking to finance people, they don't think of quality software as being something that should be on the clinical side of the hospital. They think of the quality software as a software on the financial side of the organization, software that, identifies things like what opportunities are there to get more revenue if a quality objective was hit, or software that helps them understand the variance between what doctors are using, what products or techniques, so that the finance folks can suggest that there's less variation. And man, that's a very different way of looking at quality. I mean, I would agree the less variation you have, the more quality you have, but that the tools of quality look so different from those two worlds.
Yeah.
I'm on the right track here, right? You hear those same things, or would you restate that in a different way?
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised, because I've worked with a lot of finance people in my past, and I've worked with a lot of actuaries and like number cruncher type of folks. And we do look at things differently, but really, I mean, in the whole scheme of things, they're not incorrect by thinking that way, because it's like, you have loss exposure, you have dollars, and if the exposure is something that has merit, you're going to pay dollars out the door. And being able to juggle that and figure out, across the enterprise, what do you need? What do you improve? Like, they look at it completely different. And that's where I think is the gap and the lack of understanding on the clinician side, is they're not exposed to that every day. They may not even know who the CFO is, or, they're just in there doing their clinical stuff, and they're like, well, I have no idea like what this finance guy wants or needs. And they get a little nervous. If you ever talk to an actuary about your reserving practices, not every risk manager is savvy with reserving claims. If you're managing your claims management within the organization and you do not have a TPA doing it for you, you got to know how to reserve things and how to value these cases and their loss exposures. And part of that is dealing with the finance team. So if that piece is missing, and sometimes it is, they don't have that exposure to that world, and it's totally foreign to them. So I think, I get how the actuaries and the finance people think and the kinds of things that they want to see. It's just, figuring out, how to blend those two different departments to be able to foster, a more workable relationship. So, but I think it's done the way I said, maybe they can do rounding, maybe they can do some sort of lunch and learn or a podcast, or, because so much is lost. There's so much on the highway of information that we as risk managers and clinicians have to deal with. It's really overwhelming. And you get to the point where you're like, we can only take so much as a person, that information, before how much do we retain? How much do we lose? And so that's where it comes in handy. If you have, like, you and I created some documents to help risk managers on risk assessments and stuff. And to have that sort of tool available and on your desk to say, okay, this is what this person will want, at the end of the year or at the end of the quarter. So I'm going to focus on that. I'm not going to forget. I'm going to tape it up so I can constantly have it in my view. That is helpful. But I don't know, because if the finance people have never been clinicians, and maybe they're married and they're not married to a clinician, or maybe they are. They might have a greater understanding if they are married to a physician or a nurse or somebody like that. But it's hard because it's two different worlds, and you try to blend it. It's difficult, no doubt about it.
You have so many good words of advice. I'm so glad we had this conversation today. I hope many people hear it.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you want more, be sure to click like or subscribe. If you'd like to appear on our program, be sure to fill out the SurveyMonkey below. Most important though, if you know someone who should hear this video, please forward it to them so that together we can all work to make healthcare just a little bit less risky.